And now it's time to take a look at plants we call vascular plants. And there's going to be an entire diversity of vascular plants. Today, we just want to begin with the simplest of the vascular plants, which we also call the seedless vascular plants, because the embryo is not going to be surrounded by the nutritious material you can find in a seed or the coat, which sometimes is tough, and you can recognize when you're trying to open something like a nut, that hard covering of a nut, you have to crack open, that's the seed coat. But in the case of the seedless vascular plants, embryos just continue to develop without ever having this type of sophisticated structure for their dispersal, which we call the seed. There are going to be a couple of groups of seedless vascular plants where we're going to be concentrating mostly on one, which is going to be the Monilophyta. The Monilophyta is a phylum that includes the ferns and the horsetails. Both of those plants are readily abundant. Anywhere you look on campus, you're going to see ferns growing. You're going to see these long, stem kinds of plants with very fine, long, needle-like leaves, which we call the horsetails. And I'll bring examples to class so you can see them and touch them and feel them as well. So these seedless vascular plants are going to be, like all vascular plants, Sporophyte dominant, which means that the sporophyte, the generation of plants responsible for producing the gametophytes, first by making spores, are going to be the largest ones and the most easy to recognize. So remember, every time you're looking at a fern frond with all the beautiful leaves that are extending in all directions, you're looking at the sporophyte. If you're looking at grass on a grassy meadow, the grass plants are going to be the Sporophyte generation. Let's go and look at the trees of a forest. If you're looking at a tree, if you're looking at a flowering bush, and a lot of things are flowering right now in the springtime, those are going to be the Sporophyte plants, the members of the Sporophyte generation. And so what is challenging now is that, yeah, it's nice that the sporophytes are dominant and we can see them everywhere, but where are the gametophytes? Well, that's going to be a long story I will be explaining to you over several classes and maybe a few videos as well. Let's focus, as I said just a moment ago, on a little bit of the characteristics and the life cycle of the Monilophytes, which includes the ferns. So here we are going to find that the plants that we call the sporophytes, changing over to laser pointer mode, sporophytes, like these fern fronds you have over here, they are going to be diploid. By definition, the sporophyte generation is always the diploid one, the one where the cells of those organisms are contain two sets of chromosomes in the nucleus. Well, here we're going to find something interesting with the ferns, in that the leaves have the ability to produce spores. And so we will be looking at these in just a moment. We call them sporophylls, but I want to tell you more about it. Look underneath the frond of a fern, and you're going to find these clusters of sporangia. So what you see here, these, I'm going to try to magnify this illustration so you can see better. What you see here as little yellow balloon-like structures, those are not the spores themselves, but the capsules that are producing the spores. So those are sporangia. One of these clusters of sporangia is called the sorus. And because the plants themselves are diploid, they must produce haploid spores through the process of meiosis. Here we're looking at just one sporangium from this cluster we have over here. So one sporangium is going to produce spores and release them, and those spores will be eventually developing into the new generation of gametophytes. Here you see what a fern gametophyte looks like. They're tiny. They live sometimes on the surface of the soil, and sometimes they live just beneath the upper layer of dirt where ferns live. And they're purpose, as you know, is going to be producing the next generation of sporophytes. Gametophytes are haploid. And so the making of sperm and eggs is going to be by a division that maintains the haploid number of chromosomes. From N, we go back to N, the ploidy of the egg and the ploidy of the sperm. Now let's, and by the way, so after fertilization happens, then the new sporophyte will begin to develop. And this is called a life cycle because it goes around and around and around. Let's talk a little bit about the characteristics of vascular plants that we didn't see with the bryophytes because they were much simpler. One of those is going to be the presence of vascular tissues. There are two, and I made reference to these a couple of times before. Xylem is going to be a type of network of vessels that are going to be conducting mostly water from the soil over to the places where photosynthesis takes place. It's usually higher up in the plant. And here we can see in this micrograph one of these vascular bundles you can find in vascular plants. These larger openings you see over here, it's like a cross section. Imagine like you have a whole bunch of tubes and you make a slice just to make this cross section. These larger vessels, you can see the larger diameter, are going to correspond to the xylem. They also have larger and thicker cell walls, and that's because the cell walls are strengthened by a compound known as lignin. Phloem is going to be made up of cells that are also like tubes, and these are going to be smaller in diameter. Take a look side by side. Here's the xylem, and look at this is going to be the phloem. Another difference you're going to notice is that the cell walls of phloem is not going to be as thick. They are not lignified like the cell walls of xylem are going to be. And one more difference worth mentioning right now is that these cells of the xylem, these larger, thick-walled cells, are going to be dead when they are functioning, when the plant is growing and depending on transportation of materials through the xylem. These cells are dead, they are hollow. And so where the cytoplasm used to be, now we have the space for water to be moving. That is not the case with phloem. These cells making the phloem are going to be alive when the plant is alive and functioning as well. One characteristic we also notice in the vascular plants is that they're going to have more elaborate root systems. And what makes them elaborate is that here the function is not only anchoring the plant, but it is also going to be absorbing nutrients. And there's even one more. Some plants also use the roots to store materials for a later time when photosynthesis may not be happening at a rate the plant will need it to happen. And so instead of relying on the sugars made of the leaves by photosynthesis, plants may begin to tap into the resources. This is no irony, this is no coincidence. They tap the resources stored into this tap root system. We also call these tap roots because they are burying deeper and deeper into the soil in comparison to something like this, like a fibrous root system. Leaves are going to be also more sophisticated. The little tiny leaves of a moss will not be sufficient to provide for all of the needs in terms of sugar, in terms of food that a plant that is larger is going to be demanding or requiring. And so it is true that vascular plants can grow taller, but with growing taller also come more difficulties and challenges, such as a greater need for water. Well, it's not a problem because the roots use their xylem to transporting water in larger amounts and faster. But there's also going to be a greater need for sugars. Well, that's not a problem because there's going to be more photosynthesis taking place in the more complex and the larger leaves you can find in the vascular plants. The leaves of vascular plants are going to be divided into two categories, microphylls and megaphylls. Microphylls are seen only in one group of vascular plants, only in the lycophytes, the clove mosses. And so you can recognize a microphyll because there's just going to be one single vein. As you can imagine, this vein is going to be bundle of vascular structures, including xylem and phloem. But if you look at megaphylls, mega means large, larger leaves. Megaphylls are going to have not only just one vein, but several veins, sometimes branching in different directions or sometimes running parallel to one another. So now you know the difference between the microphylls of vascular plants like the clove mosses, the lycophytes, and then we see the megaphylls you can find in everything from the monilophytes, such as the ferns, and all the way up into the flowering plants and the cone-producing plants. Another modification we can find in leaves, and I was making reference to this just a moment ago, is the presence of sporophylls. And so sporophylls are going to be modified leaves where spores are going to be produced. Here we're looking at a picture of a real fern. And this is going to be a cluster of many capsules. Remember, these little dots you see here are not the spores themselves, but the capsules within which the spores are going to be produced. Sometimes the sporophylls are going to be bundling up, forming a structure like a cone. And so think, for example, about a pine cone. There is going to be an example of a strobily, a structure where spores are going to be produced. And here we see the strobily of something like a horsetail as well. And that is going to be clusters of modified leaves with the potential, with the ability of making spores. The classification, here we've talked about the lycophytes or the clove mosses. Here you see different examples. Here you see a type of a clove moss known as Selaginella, which you can find in warm, sometimes mildly temperate places, also with a lot of moisture. And the phylum Monilophyta, where we see the ferns. Here's more of the horsetails. And here you see a whisk fern, which is also part of the phylum Monilophyta. You can find them just about virtually in every part of the world. The only limitation that these monilophytes have is that they can live relatively away from water, but they still need water or periods of time when water is abundant, because remember that the sperm, which is flagellated, has to swim over to where the eggs are for the purpose of fertilization, and fertilization is what leads to the development of these beautiful sporophytes you see right here. And that is going to be all that I have to say for right now with regards to an introduction to the seedless vascular plants.